Hi, I'm Jeff Brady with Roundtree Brady Insurance here in Savannah, Georgia.
Do buyers in Savannah typically need separate flood insurance?
Yeah, so if you're buying, anywhere, whether you're in Savannah, coastal Georgia, if you're buying insurance here, there may be a company out there that actually includes flood. I've seen that on manufactured homes, for example, randomly enough. But as far as your typical home insurance, if you're buying in Savannah, flood insurance is totally separate. You need a separate policy for it, and it's not going to be covered under your home policy. If you drive around in a spring storm and you can see whether you're in Midtown or other areas where you get the kind of it's not coastal flooding, but it's really more of your heavy rainstorm, you get street flooding, that sort of stuff. Nationally, 40% of flood claims, flooded structures are in X-flood zones. And an X-flood zone is in an area where you're not required to carry flood insurance. And I think too many people think that just because you're not in a special flood hazard area means that you can't flood. Well, we've seen it. If we look back to Hurricane Debbie in 2024, the areas in Richmond Hill that were impacted, along the Ogeechee River, a lot of those areas, people don't think about that. We've had hurricanes where we get coastal surge. And whether you're on the islands, so Wilmington, Skidaway, Burnside, some of those areas, just a flood zone can mean 1 inch of ground difference in the elevation. That's, the difference between being required and not. There's no wall in between the zones. So typically, if you're in a lower risk property, you're going to pay lower premiums. And that's the best way to protect yourself. If you're worried about hurricanes, if you're worried about that coastal surge, then having your home insurance and having flood insurance is the best combination.
How does one check flood zones in Chatham County?
You can go to your county's GIS website. You can also just have your agent or insurance agent look it up and they can provide an answer for you.
Rapid fire questions, true or false?
Flood damage is covered under standard home insurance, true or false?
False.
If I'm not in a flood zone, I don't need flood insurance.
False.
I'm Brandy Jenkins with the Heather Murphy Group, and I'm here today with a local insurance agent.
Hi, I'm Brooke Williams. I am a local independent insurance agent with Lowcountry Assurance and Advisors.
And then in our area, because we're coastal, I know when I'm shopping properties for people, they always ask me about flood zones. And I always let them know, like, your X zone is a no flood zone. Correct. And you can get insurance if you need it. And I highly suggest you still do. And it's normally less expensive. And it's really hard for us in this area to tell you without looking, like, we can't visually tell you if you're in a flood zone. Whereas this property here that we're sitting in, it could be not a flood zone, and the property adjacent to it could be an AE, which is a higher flood zone. So it's not like neighborhood specific, it's literally house to house specific. For flood insurance, what do you suggest? And then if they're not in a flood zone, what do you suggest?
Yes, so flood insurance, it's tricky because if you look at a flood map, the zone, it literally is just like squiggles. And in Richmond Hill, when we had all that flooding, the neighborhood that got the most of it was not in a flood zone. So a lot of them did not have flood insurance. However, they were in a flood zone, I think 18 years prior, before they changed the maps. So just because you're not in a flood zone doesn't mean that you don't have the possibility of a flood. Now, a flood is anything that is considered rising water from the earth. So flood is not going to cover a pipe bursting in your wall. That would be homeowner's insurance. Anything that it's rising from the ground, that is flood. So I would suggest that you shop it. There are markets, FEMA markets, and there are private markets. A lot of the time the private markets can get you a better rate. So as an independent agent, I have multiple flood options that I can run for you, and then you can see the difference. But it is very important to check that out. And if you ever have a question, if you're in a flood zone or not, you can always ask your agent too, because we can run it fairly quickly.
So today we're actually out in Townsend, Georgia, which is about an hour and a half from Savannah. I had clients reach out to me about buying on the water. So we drove out to Townsend to find them a property on the water that fit their needs, that had a dock. So one thing that's important that most people ask me about when buying coastal is flood insurance. This property here is actually elevated up from the water. So you see we have the marsh and the water behind us. And so it's elevated up and it's in an X flood zone, which means they don't require flood insurance. So they actually don't have to have it. And I get a lot of questions asked, if I don't need it, do I really need it? I'm never gonna tell someone no. We are coastal, the water's right there. So you always, in my opinion, need to have flood insurance. If it's not required, it's not nearly as expensive. It's typically under $800 a year for that property to have the flood insurance on it, because flood insurance is rising water. So it's not gonna be just a leak in your house that's gonna flood. This is gonna be rising water. We are tidal here. So your tides come in and go out daily, and you have to just take that in mind when we have storm surges as well. So another popular question and another observation that buyers should make when they're purchasing in coastal Georgia is you have to understand, again, that we're with the tide. So this is low tide. And with low tide, you can see behind us here, we have oyster rakes and we have mud. So a lot of folks, when they're coming from areas that are just lakes, they don't really fully understand what that is. And so when it's low tide around the property that you're looking at, you really want to inspect what's under it. So if you know you have oyster rakes and barnacles, you don't want to just hop off your dock and go swimming in that. You want to be kind of prepared for maybe a cut on your foot when that happens. Another thing you can see here at this property is they have reinforced their property. So a lot of the ones that we looked at were not reinforced. They were just the ground. So with storm surges and tides, it's going to eventually erode and wash that away, and you're going to need to reinforce it either this way, or you can see over here they have rocks. And so there's different processes for reinforcing your property, but it's when you're buying a property on the water, you need to make sure that you're taking all of that into your consideration. You're also salt and marsh. You can smell it out here. It smells like home to me, and so it smells fine to me, but that salt water, that marsh water, will do wear and tear on your docks. Like this one is wood. A lot of people are now moving into like a more sturdy surface to do their decking with, like a teak or something. And then you want to keep your pylons and everything really secure after surges with the water. You just want to kind of double check all of that and just make sure that everything is still where it's supposed to be.
How are hurricane or windstorm deductibles calculated?
Yeah, so that percentage base we talked about, that's going to be a percentage of your coverage. So, you know, if you've got a $200,000 house, a $500,000 house, whatever it may be, if you see a percentage deductible, whether it's a wind and hail deductible, a named storm deductible, it could be a hurricane duration deductible, it depends on the insurer. But when you see a percentage, it is a percentage of coverage. Simple math. So $400,000 house, 2% deductible, it's $8,000. So in some cases, if it is a wind and hail deductible, it could be any wind loss. It could be hurricane, tropical storm, cold front that pushes through in the spring when we start heating up and get that cold air and it gets very volatile, you know, hailstorms, that sort of thing. Again, depending on the policy, depending on the company. Now, if it's some companies, it's only if there's a hurricane watch or warning that's been raised. Some companies, if the National Hurricane Center names it. Right? And so depending on which one, you have to understand exactly what your responsibility is if there is a loss and when it's triggered, because it's not a standard thing across all companies. So now we actually, in Chatham County, in the last 2 weeks, we actually got a new policy where ours is 1% at a minimum that we can write in Chatham County, which is, for me, is extremely exciting because most companies want to go to 2. So that means that we can give a lower deductible. So, you know, that's the biggest complaint people have is they have damage, but because of the coverage amount, now they have a 10, 15, heaven forbid, higher percent, you know, 10, 15, $20,000 deductible. Well, now at 1%, if it's a $500,000 home, it's only $5,000, not 10. And that's huge. And it's also replacement cost coverage. There's no roof schedule, anything along those lines. We're not depreciating the roof. That's a beautiful thing about it, which we're excited about having that for our clients moving forward.